Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Stryd coaching webinar. My name is Evan Schwartz, and today we'll be going over some Stryd data. We'll be taking a look at 4 5K races run by one athlete in 1 month. We're going to talk about a little bit about the athlete background, what some of the future and current training goals are. Then we're going to take a look at each individual 5K race. These were all run between late November and middle to late December of 2021, so fairly recent. And we're going to look at the differences between these 5Ks as well as some of the training, just so there is some context. We're going to be looking at some summary data in some slides. And then we're also going to be jumping into Power Center, how you can view athletes' data in the coach's view to look at some of the context between these 5K races and what some of the different goals were for each of the 5K. This is an athlete that I personally coach with Stryd and have coached for about the past year, 2 years, something like that. Let's jump into the slides and take a look at this athlete and their data. So we're going to analyze 4 5K races in 1 month. Athlete background is a male athlete, late 20s, training for a goal spring marathon. At the start of this 5K racing block, the starting auto-calculated critical power was 328 watts. Spoiler alert, by the end of this month period, the auto CP had gone up to 366 watts, mainly by the way of time trial. And we'll take a look at the different progression and some of the different workouts along the way. But the intention starting off, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about this in the next slide, but the intention starting off was to get a really, really good base foundation for time trials and different efforts as we headed into the winter months before turning a little bit more specific focus to some of the longer efforts, some nice long runs, some threshold work, preparing for a goal spring marathon. Let's take a look at the dates of the races. So the dates of these races span between November 25th, 2021, all the way to December 18th, 2021. If you're in the United States, you might recognize November 25th as a Thursday, the last Thursday in November. This was a turkey trot to kick off this racing block. This athlete specifically wanted to race all of these 5K efforts, and there were a couple more, throughout the rest of the winter into the spring. The main focus from the athlete, and I think this is a really interesting thing to talk about from the coaching side, with Stryd in particular, is that athletes are still going to have some of those goals and their passions that they want to include, and you can leverage Stryd data and that Stryd experience to kind of inform how they might tackle one 5K, a little bit different than the 5K the next weekend, or we might have a little bit different intention over the whole course of a longer training block. And we can use Stryd, can use Power, can use a couple different things along that way to maybe convince the athlete, hey, we should take this approach, or we can reflect on a race result and say, hey, that was great. Now we have some data to go off of, and let's build a great training block off of that. So the dates of the races spanned from the end of November to almost the end of December, but 4 weeks in a row, we had a 5K essentially time trial every single week. Let's take a look at this first race, and I'm actually going to jump now into the Power Center view. We're going to take a look at the week leading up to this and the week kind of surrounding, and we'll keep doing this, kind of go back and forth between the slide view and the Power Center view, just so we can understand the full context. Because I think it's really important not just to say, hey, here are 4 5K races, and these are, only being compared in a vacuum. We need to understand the context around these as well. So let's jump into the Power Center view and take a look at the athletes and the context leading up to these different types of efforts. So the athlete typically follows a schedule of having 2 workouts in the middle of the week with a weekend long run, which is fairly typical, I would say. Mondays are typically reserved for a little bit more recovery. We usually include a set of strides, so some faster running, typically 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off. This athlete typically uses the Stryd workout builder or final surge to send workouts to their Garmin watch. The week of the race, we had a total volume, the first race, we had a total volume of 68 miles, so a little bit over 100 kilometers for that week. 8 hours and 43 minutes of total moving time, an RSS of 413. Monday was a pretty easy recovery day. Tuesday, we had a pre-race tune-up, sort of just, something to keep that frequency of working out. We did a 10-minute progression into a 5 times 1 minute on, 1 minute off. So we did a pretty nice and easy warm-up, a 10-minute solid block, a 5-minute little bit down, little bit recovery, and then we did 5 times 1 minute on, 1 minute off. Initially here, the goal for this first 5K was to get a good establishment and a good effort in without having too specific of a power goal. The 5 times 1 minute on, 1 minute off at this point, because the athlete had not done many recent time trials, was to use a Stryd race power calculator just based on the last 90 days of data and give a semi-realistic number to shoot for the athlete in these 1 minute on, 1 minute off sections. We're supposed to be around about the projected 5K power based on the athlete not having done any harder efforts or harder time trials. We can see that the athlete felt pretty good here on this last 1 minute repeat, going all the way up to 361 watts. Not too much to say here, rather than this is a pretty easy sort of maintenance workout and really getting that confidence going ahead of race day. We did a easy 6 miles, or easy about 50 minutes with 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off. Then the athlete had their first race in this series. This was a turkey trot. The goal here was to go out pretty even and, not leave anything left in the tank necessarily, but not go out too hard to the point of not being able to finish well. So we can see the first kilometer split here was 338 watts. The athlete, started relatively around that mid 340s, a little bit lower than 340s, like the Stryd race power calculator had suggested. But the communication here was to start the first kilometer pretty conservative, pretty relaxed, and then give yourself the chance to close hard. And we can see by this progression, progressing to the next kilometer split, the second K was 355 watts, speeding up a little bit. And then the third was 361 watts, going up to 381 for the fourth split, and closing in 302 for the last kilometer at 388 watts. So I would definitely say this athlete had a lot left in the tank. We can see some shifts here. The ground contact time starting at 199 milliseconds, progressing all the way down to 176 milliseconds by the end. So the athlete really picked things up towards the end. And this was a really good establishing effort, not making the athlete feel, unconfident in their ability to run hard after not having any sort of recent time trials. This was a great effort for the athlete to be able to reflect on, and we could build some training off of this. We can see that the CP to start, again, was 328 watts. And then after the race, it had updated to 355 watts here. And so we can see that the athlete definitely didn't have as many, recent time trials. And so this 5K was a really good way to boost up that auto CP calculation and get a little bit closer critical power to work off of for some workouts. The next day, we did a little bit over an hour easy run, and then we did a 2-hour long run on the weekend. So 2 days after the race, keeping things pretty light, conservative, starting with a pretty easy warm up and then just bumping up slightly, a 25-minute segment slightly above that, another 25-minute segment slightly above that, 20-minute segment slightly above that, going from 258 up to 272 watts, up to 284, then doing a nice and easy cool down. The athlete ran a little bit extra, and that's totally fine. The communication was to go for about an hour 45 to 2 hours based on feeling, and with it being around a holiday, feeling pretty easy, pretty light in terms of recovery. So we decided to go between 145 up to 2 hours, and the athlete did exactly that. Rounding out the week was another hour run to, again, bring it to a total of 68 miles, or a little bit over 100 kilometers for the training week, a little bit under 9 hours training time, with a weekly RSS of 413. Let's jump back to the slides here. So again, the thing I wanted to stress about presenting this first race was that the intention was to hold back specifically the first kilometer, and then give yourself the ability to run hard in the last 2 to 3 kilometers. We could see that pace dropped from the mid 330s per kilometer, all the way down to 302 for the last K. So that made the athlete feel very confident in the training going forward. Second 5K was the next week. We're still working off of that 355 watt mark for the auto CP. The intention here was to start a little bit harder, a little bit faster, and let's jump back into the Power Center view to take a look at the weekly training context here. So Monday was another easy hour run, a little bit faster, a little bit higher power because of that new training zone. But the communication here to that athlete, and I always think it's an interesting thing too. If you're coaching somebody and they're using the Stryd app, or they're using Power Center, and they see their zone suddenly shift way up, it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to suddenly boost their easy days. And so the communication to the athlete here was to maybe go off of feel, but it's okay to run a little bit above what, the previous 70 to 80% value that might have been their zone one. Have that little bit of communication to go a little bit above that. Tuesday, we were coming off of, again, that weekend long run. We had 2 days recovery, and so we're doing a 5K race week tune-up. This ended up being a little bit under 10 miles total, and it was 61:30 of running time. Did a 15-minute warm-up, and then a 15-minute progression, starting at 306 watts average up to 318 watts average for the 10-minute section, the 5-minute section, respectfully. Then we did a 3-minute recovery block, and we ran 2 times 2 minutes, right at about what the projected 5K would have been. So we wanted to do a really light progression, so 15-minute progression, recovery block, 2 times 2 minutes, and then 3 times 40 seconds. The athlete said that this definitely felt harder. The specific 40-second repeats with a decent amount of rest, 80 seconds of rest, so double work to rest ratio. We started, right under 400 watts was the goal here. The athlete ran a little bit too hard probably for this second repeat, and felt it on this third repeat. But overall, the idea was to not stress the legs with a super long duration heading into this second 5K in the series, instead of doing too much too soon and really going for it in the second week of this 4-week racing block. We wanted to have a pretty easy, gradual progression, followed by some little bit higher intensity repeats, and the job was done there. We had 2 easy days, and then another race week tune-up. We did a pretty long warm-up relative. We did a 20-minute warm-up instead of a normal 10 to 15 like this athlete usually does. Then we just did another 2 times 2 minutes, a little bit more conservative. We didn't necessarily want to do 10 times 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off, like we had done in the previous few months if we had a race coming up. We just did 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, another 2 minute on, 2 minute off. So pretty easy, light workout ahead of the next 5K coming up over the weekend. Let's jump into that as well. This overall training week was down in terms of RSS. So this is something that we typically see, not only if you reduce volume, reduce intensity, but if all of a sudden the athlete had been working off of a critical power of 328 up until the previous weekend, and the auto CP jumps up to 355, for the same exact efforts from the previous week, that RSS is going to be lower. And so that's just something that we knew was going to happen. And we just planned, some pretty easy sessions. And we didn't really worry about trying to maintain that same running stress score because the auto CP had just been bumped up. The overall training distance for that week was 58 miles, or just under 100 kilometers for that week. And then a training time of 7 hours and 12 minutes. Let's take a look at this second 5K here. The intention here was, again, go out a little conservative. We were expecting somewhere between 365 to 375 for an average, and the athlete averaged 373, so right towards that little bit higher end. But the goal was to finish feeling well, and this is something that we specifically talked about practicing, making sure that last kilometer feels good. We don't want to be going backwards at all. The athlete started off with 363 watts and 365 for the first 2K, and then picked it up to 376 and 375 for the third and fourth K. And the last kilometer was 386 watts, or 3 flat for that last kilometer, which is fantastic. The cadence really, really picks up. We see that ground contact time go down a little bit when the athlete decides to pick it up as well. And everything was accomplished here. We ran 16:17 for the 5K versus the 16:45 from the previous week. So we had a really, really good benchmark, a really good established race intensity to work off of, and we knew exactly how hard to push for the next time based on the Stryd race power calculator, but also how the athlete was feeling during some of those race week tune-ups. Let's go back to the slides here and take a look at this next 5K. So this was the week after. We decided to employ a sort of similar strategy as the week before, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth after we get some context. But we wanted to try and go out just a little bit faster. The previous week we did the first 1 or 2Ks around that mid 360s. And we want to go out just a little bit harder and see how the athlete felt handling that, with the primary goal of still running fast towards the end. So this athlete did this third 5K. Let's jump back into the Power Center view and take a look at the week of training context. The second 5K was on a Sunday, so we wanted a little bit more recovery. We didn't do a long run necessarily. We did a 4-mile warm up for that 5K. So we had about 7 miles, or about 12 kilometers of running by the time the 5K ended. And then we did another 6 miles, or about 10K of running. So we didn't have a traditional long run because the race was on a Sunday. So we added a little bit more recovery after that second 5K. Heading into the third week, we did 2 back-to-back days, very scary, similar it runs, even though they were in 2 completely different areas. 7.55 miles, 257 watts, 253 watts, respectively. Just easy 60 minutes on an easy day is what this athlete typically prefers. The Wednesday, so 3 days after the second 5K, we did another sort of tune-up workout. Because we didn't get any long extended duration the week before, we just wanted to do a pretty relaxed tempo. We started with a 10-minute block at 300 watts average. We wanted the athlete to feel pretty calm and easy in this progression. Progressed from 302 up to 316. Up to 325. And we took a 5-minute recovery before doing 5 times 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. So equal work to rest here. The goal was to run probably a little bit more aggressive than 5K intensity, just the tiniest bit more aggressive, starting maybe at that 4.5K down to 3K, or maybe that 15-minute down to 10-minute sort of intensity. Athlete managed this pretty well. The idea for the 30 seconds off was to not back off a ton, but to keep sort of that pressure on. And then we did a nice and easy 16-minute, 17-minute cool down, something around there. And that was that sort of midweek workout, not really adding too much time on feet. We kept it around 71 minutes total, 72 minutes total, a little bit under 11 miles for that session. We had our only other workout of the week as a hour run with strides, and this is pretty normal. If we we're in the third week of this 4 week block, we don't necessarily need to do a whole nother workout on this Friday here because we have another Sunday race. We just need to get a little bit of turnover. We want the athlete feeling pretty good. That's exactly what we did. We had another hour easy run, so we're not really tapering too hard for this third 5K. Let's jump into this 5K. There's one specific point I want to make at the end of this, and if you're used to using the Stryd Coach's view, you might be able to pick out some of that data already. This athlete ran 16:22 for this third 5K, and the goal here was to try and maintain that middle 3 kilometers. So go out, a little bit more aggressive than we did the week before, and then just try and maintain and close pretty hard. We knew the course was going to be a little bit different, and we also looked at the weather ahead of time, and we knew that it was going to be a little bit windier heading into this 5K. So we wanted to make sure that we were recognizing that, and we wanted to make sure that that effort was still there and not really pay attention to the time too much. And I think this one was a little bit colder as well. So we started off right in that low 370 watt range for the athlete. The cadence has really picked up. And when we look at the last sort of slide we have in this presentation, we can look at all these races and all the kilometer splits or the averages against each other and just see how the athlete dealt with things on an average. The middle 3K was exactly right. The 4th K, we reviewed the race data afterwards and agreed that it was probably a little bit too much of a back off because the last kilometer was 385 watts versus the 386 watts from the week before. So, within 1/3% or just 1 watt lower over the last kilometer. We can see the last kilometer split was 311 instead of 3 flat like the week before. The course is pretty flat, if not a little tiny bit of a slight up and a slight down for this finishing stretch. But the main thing that I like to look at back here, because usually if an athlete is in the moment and they're clicking off their watch each kilometer and they see that their last kilometer was 311 versus 3 flat the previous week, they say, oh no, how did I get so much slower? I was working, I thought just as hard. Well, the main thing that stands out here is that the air power for this last kilometer split was 10%. So pretty cold, very windy. This is the windiest kilometer of any of these 5K races. This was the closing kilometer of this 5K race. And so, if an athlete comes to a coach and says, hey, I don't really know what was going on. I felt like I was working harder. And then, they're wearing a wind version of the Stryd. You can reflect on the state and say, hey, you worked exactly as hard as you did the week before. And we can show that, just because you ran 311 a little bit slower than that 3 flat K the week before, it doesn't mean you weren't working any harder. It doesn't mean that stimulus and that effort and intention wasn't there. It just means that the wind was blowing in your face and you're running very fast still to close out the race. So that was the main sort of point. And then if we click on the air power, we can view the whole race course as well and just see the sections where we have this sort of massive wind coming out of the northeast. Anytime the athlete kind of turns back in that direction, especially in the last kilometer, we can see it just coming as a pretty straight headwind. 10% air power, that's no joke, especially in the last kilometer of a goal 5K. We had a little bit of a long cool down here, kind of following the same sort of pattern. We didn't have a dedicated long run because this was on a Sunday instead of a Saturday race. And so we extended the cool down just a little bit. We did a pretty light run, though we didn't do any post-race workouts, and we kept things at a pretty easy intensity. The overall weekly RSS was 336, which was just a little bit above the previous week. Distance was 63 miles, or just over 100 kilometers, and the weekly training time was 7 hours and 56 minutes to round out that training week. So that was the third 5K. Let's take a look at this last 5K. This one, the sort of goal intention was to get out a little hot, see who was kind of in the race, and then just hang on and do whatever was needed. to win, basically. And so there wasn't really an intention of having to close too hard. We still wanted to practice going out at that sort of intensity we knew had been working the previous 2 5Ks, but not put too much damage in the legs at the end of this month-long racing block every weekend. And so we can jump back into the Power Center view here and view this last week and view the context around this training. And we can see the hour easy, it remains a staple. This easy run was definitely a little bit easier than the week before. Week before we averaged 257 watts for an hour. The week later, we averaged 229 watts. So this is usually a sign for me. With this specific athlete too, they communicate when they're feeling like they need to run a little bit slower, a little bit easier on an easy day. And that gets, all the thumbs up from my side. We want to make sure that we're not pushing too hard. We kept a similar sort of frequency when we had that race on the Sunday. We were going to work out again on this Wednesday. We did a set of strides, another hour easy run with some strides in the middle of that, just 8 times 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off. Nothing even, close. We didn't average close to that 5K power, just something to get the legs moving. This is probably a little bit closer to that 8 kilometer or about 25 to 27 minute ability for this athlete. We did another hour easy run on that Thursday, and this Friday session was actually kind of interesting. We knew that the intention wasn't going to be to go out super, super hard in this fourth 5K. So we decided to do a pretty light workout, very light tempo, light progression the day before the 5K. And see how that felt for the athletes on that next day. So we did a 20-minute progression structured in the way of a 10-minute section, then another 10-minute section slightly above that. We took a 3-minute recovery portion and then did 3 times 1 minute on, 1 minute off. Very, very light. I would say this is a little bit closer to 10K effort for the minute on with the 2 minutes off, and the recovery for the 2 minutes off was probably overrun a tiny, tiny little bit, which means the athlete was feeling pretty recovered from the previous weekend. Then we did 3 times 30 seconds on with a minute off. Athlete was feeling pretty good here, but then by the time the third repeat came around for the 30-second on, it fell right back into that range where they were sort of prescribed. And then a nice easy cool down after that as well. And that's the day before this last 5K here. So let's take a look a little bit closer at this last 5K. It was run pretty dang even with a tiny, tiny little pickup. At the end, we can see that the air power behaved a little bit more than the week before. We get those pretty consistent 4 to 5% air power values for this athlete. The intention, again, was to go out right around, the first 1 or 2 kilometers, what we had been doing, that 370 to 375, then just settle in and do whatever you need to do to win. The last K was run in 3 minutes, 14 seconds, but we can see at 362 watts, that's 24 watts lower than the previous week, but we still ran almost the same exact time because the conditions were a little less blustery, a little bit less windy. And that was the fourth 5K in this block. We did a little bit of a longer warm-up, a little bit of a longer cool down. So we had a 6-mile warm-up, a 6-mile cool down. With that race the day before, we didn't need to force a long run into that into that specific training block cluster run that weekend. We did an hour easy run. Then I want to point out one thing really quick too. The Monday following that fourth 5K, so 2 days after that, we decided to take off. One of the athletes' goals that I actually thought was really interesting. Before we did this racing block, we set out some goals, and one of the athletes' goals was to take 3 voluntary rest days, which I think is actually really, really important, to have a day on the calendar where you could run 30 minutes to 60 minutes easy, and the athlete just saying, you know what, I feel like I can take a off day. I feel like I can take a day very easy, not have to go through the motions and run, especially at the end of a 5K race block like this one. So we closed out that training week, and we had a weekly RSS of 330, a total training volume of 63 miles or just over 100 kilometers, and a moving time of 7 hours and 54 minutes. Very, very close to the week before. We took an off day, like I said, on that next Monday, and that wrapped up that whole racing block. I had a great time setting that up, going through it, reviewing that data, trying to piece together some workouts that were filling some of those gaps that the athlete might have been missing by having the intention to focus on each of these 5Ks on a weekend. We experimented with a little bit longer warm up, a little bit longer cool down to see how that sort of felt. We experimented with some different types of workout structures, whether we're doing the back-to-back intensity days or we are going to focus on trying to run, a little bit faster than we were comfortable for some of those 30-second on, 30-second off, but really having fun with training and racing and getting really back to the roots of enjoyment of the sport too. So let's pull up this last slide here. We're going to compare some of this race data, and then we're going to wrap up this webinar. The race data here, we just have listed from left to right, the different metrics. So power in terms of watts for the average for each 5K. And then from top down, we have the first 5K, second 5K, third, and fourth. We have pace in minutes per kilometer. We have elevation in terms of meters gained over the whole race. So we can see which of these courses was a little bit hillier, which was a little bit flatter. We have the average cadence for the race, and we can see this sort of increase through the race series, which I think was really interesting. One note here, because I feel like people might ask too, this athlete races in the Saucony type A8, I believe is the training flat or the racing flat. So not a carbon plated shoe, not a shoe with a 40 millimeter stack height, a shoe that's a little bit lower stack height. I believe it's a 4 millimeter stack height on the type A8. Heart rate disclaimer, this is coming from a wrist optical based heart rate monitor. I included it because it came with the data. The form power, we can see, if we want to take a look at the form power ratio, we can, go through those as well. Ground contact time, we can see that it hovered pretty consistently between 188 and 191 without much variation. The LSS was kind of all over the place, but I feel like this was because there were some different course profiles. Vertical oscillation also changed a little bit. And then air power was about the same, except for that third 5K. We can remember that last nasty kilometer at 10% air power influences a lot there, but pretty typical sort of air power there. The interesting thing to me is that we have, similar averages for some of these races, but we can see because of the elevation profile differences and because of the way that the athlete ran the races in a sort of different fashion, we can see some disparity and some differences there as well. So I always really, really like to, if, we just sit down and decide to do a training block like this and a racing block like this, I like to look at a little bit bigger picture and tell the athlete, hey, here's the information we can pull out at that 10,000 foot view, that bird's eye view, way up. And then we can sort of zoom in on some of the details. And that's something that we do every week. That's something we do if, there's a specific training session that went well, didn't go as well. We zoom in a little bit more, but I always like to take a step back and look at some of the averages like this too. The next sort of goal for this athlete is going to be training for a spring marathon. And we are going to be doing some different types of testing. We have done more than enough testing over the past month, or I guess from November to December around the 5K area where we don't need to touch that for a little bit. And we're going to focus on a little bit shorter stuff, a little bit longer stuff at the same time, build up that good long run frequency and get really confident with handling a little bit higher training load as we prepare for that spring marathon. This was a webinar for Stryd talking about 4 different 5K races in 1 month. We hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions whatsoever, after watching this webinar, you can either leave a comment in the comments section and we will respond there. Or you can send an email to coach@stryd.com and we will do our best to answer as fast as possible. We'd love to hear any suggestions you might have for future webinars, any information that you're really keen to hear that we can bring to you. And we look forward to bringing you another Stryd coaching webinar in the very near future. We'll be back with another one very soon. For now, that wraps it up, and we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.